The cold wind whistled through the busy city streets as people rushed past, bundled in their coats, their heads down, lost in their own worlds. The sun had begun to set, casting a soft golden glow over the sidewalks. Among the moving crowd, barely noticed, stood a young girl, no older than 14. Her clothes were worn, her shoes scuffed, and her small hands trembled slightly as she lifted a battered violin to her shoulder. At first glance, she seemed like any other street performer, just another face in the sea of people trying to survive. But there was something about her, something different. Maybe it was the way she held the violin, as if it was the only thing in the world that truly belonged to her. Maybe it was the quiet determination in her eyes, or the way she took a deep breath before drawing the bow across the strings. The first note rang out, piercing through the noise of the street. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then the melody grew, weaving through the air like a whisper of something lost and forgotten. The girl played with a raw, aching beauty that seemed to pull at the very soul. It wasn't just music. It was emotion, heartbreak, hope, all wrapped into a song that had no words but told a story all the same. People continued walking at first, barely sparing a glance. Street performers were everywhere in the city, and most passers-by had learned to tune them out. But then, something changed. A man, dressed in a sleek suit and carrying a leather briefcase, paused mid-step. He turned, his brows furrowed, as if trying to remember something distant, something buried. A mother, hurrying her young son along, slowed as the child tugged at her sleeve, eyes wide with wonder. More and more people stopped, drawn in by something they couldn't quite explain. The girl didn't seem to notice them. Her eyes were closed, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The violin, though old and scratched, sang as if it had been waiting for this moment, for this song. And as she played, the world around her seemed to fade. For a few minutes, the honking cars, the hurried footsteps, the city's endless chaos, all of it disappeared into the background. Then, from the back of the gathering crowd, someone stepped forward. A man, older, with silver strands in his dark hair and a presence that seemed to command attention without effort. He stood still, watching intently, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of something deeper. He didn't just hear the music, he understood it. The girl, still unaware of the eyes on her, let the final note linger in the air before lowering her violin. A hush fell over the small crowd. For a moment, it was as if no one wanted to break the spell she had woven. Then, slowly, applause began, soft at first, then growing. Some people dropped coins into the open violin case at her feet. A woman wiped away a tear. The little boy who had stopped his mother tugged on her sleeve again, whispering something. But it was the older man's reaction that changed everything. He took a step closer, his gaze locked onto the girl, studying her as if she were a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. Then, finally he spoke, his voice, deep but gentle. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The girl flinched slightly, as if startled back to reality. Her fingers tightened around the neck of her violin. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was hesitation there, guardedness. I taught myself," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded, as if confirming something to himself. The crowd had begun to disperse, life moving on as it always did, but he remained. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card, holding it out to her. "If you ever need a place to play, come find me," he said. The girl stared at the card, her lips slightly parted. uncertainty flickering across her face. She didn't take it right away. Instead, she looked back up at him, searching his face for something. "Why?" she asked. The man smiled, but there was something sad in it. "Because someone once gave me a chance to." The wind picked up again, rustling. Through the streets, the girl glanced down at the card, then back at the man. For a long moment, she didn't move. And then, a loud voice cut through the air. "Hey, you again. I told you not to play here." A security guard was striding toward them, his face set in an annoyed scowl. The girl's eyes widened, and in an instant, she was stuffing her violin into its case, grabbing the few coins she had earned. Without another word, she turned and ran, disappearing into the crowded street before anyone could stop her. The man stood there, still holding the card, watching as she vanished. He exhaled slowly, slipping it back into his pocket. The city moved on, as it always did. But something had shifted. Something unseen, but undeniable. The music lingered, even in the silence. And somewhere, in the sea of people, a girl with a violin was running from something, or maybe toward something. And the man, he wasn't done looking for her. The man stood there for a long time, his gaze lingering on the spot where the girl had disappeared. The city had already swallowed her up, as it did with so many others. But the music she played still echoed in his mind. There was something about the way she held that violin, something that reminded him of a past he thought he had left behind. He turned and walked away, slipping the card back into his pocket. He wasn't sure if she would ever come looking for him, but something told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The girl ran, weaving through the crowded streets, her breath coming in quick gasps. She had learned long ago that staying in one place too long was dangerous. Security guards, store owners, even some of the other street performers, they all had their own rules, their own territories, and she had no one to stand up for her. She finally stopped in a quiet alley, her back pressing against the cold brick wall as she caught her breath. Her heart was still pounding, but not just from running. The man, who was he? Why had he looked at her like that? Like he knew something about her, and why did his words stay with her? She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills and coins she had managed to grab before running. It wasn't much, but it would get her through another night. She tucked the money into her worn-out backpack, then carefully unzipped the case holding her violin. Running her fingers over the wood, she let out a slow breath. This violin was all she had left of her past. It had been her mother's, once. She could still remember her mother's hands, guiding hers over the strings, teaching her how to play, the melodies they shared together, the way her mother would close her eyes and smile when the music filled the room. But those days were gone. The memories hurt, so she pushed them away, the way she always did. Across the city, the man sat in his office, staring out the window, deep in thought. His name was Daniel Carter, a well-known musician, composer, and teacher. He had spent years building a reputation in the industry, but despite all his success, he had never forgotten where he came from. He had once been just like that girl, alone, playing on the streets, hoping someone would hear him. That's why he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about her. She played with a rawness that couldn't be taught. It came from something deeper, something real. And if there was one thing he had learned in his years of working with musicians, it was that talent like that couldn't be ignored. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hey, James, I need you to do me a favor. There's a young girl, maybe 14 or 15, playing the violin on the streets. I don't know much about her, but I need to find her." There was a pause on the other end before his friends, Voice came through. That's a little vague, don't you think? Daniel sighed. I know, but she's worth finding. For the next few days, the girl, whose name was Elena, stayed hidden. She played in different spots, never staying too long in one place. The memory of that night, of Daniel's words, lingered in the back of her mind, but she tried to ignore it. She had spent too much time surviving to believe in things like second chances. But then, one evening, she found herself back at the same street corner where it had all started. She hadn't meant to come back. Her feet had just taken her there. The city was alive with movement. People coming and going, lost in their own worlds. She hesitated, glancing around, half expecting the security guard to show up again. But there was no sign of him. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her violin and began to play. This time, the melody was different. It was softer, sadder, carrying all the loneliness and longing she had buried inside her. And just like before, people began to stop, but one person stood apart from the rest. Daniel. He didn't speak. He didn't try to interrupt her. He just listened, and when she finally lowered her violin, he stepped forward. You ran last time, he said, his voice calm but firm. I don't want to scare you, but I need to ask, why are you out here? Elena gripped the neck of her violin tightly. Why do you care? She asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Because I know what it's like, Daniel said. I know what it's like to have nothing except music. And I know what it's like to think that no one sees you. Elena swallowed hard, looking away. She wasn't used to people noticing her. Not like this. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the same card he had tried to give her before. I don't know your story, and I won't force you to tell me, but I do know that you have a gift. And if you ever decide you want more than just playing on the streets, my door is open. He held out the card. Elena stared at it for a long moment, and this time she took it. As her fingers closed around the card, the wind picked up again, swirling around them. Something had changed. A door had been opened. But whether she would walk through it, that was a choice only she could make. Elena turned the small card over in her fingers, reading the name printed on it. Daniel Carter. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't place where she had heard it before. Maybe she had seen it on a poster somewhere, or heard someone mention him while playing in the streets. It didn't matter. People like him, people with polished shoes and expensive coats, didn't belong in her world. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, offering something she had never been given before, a chance. For days, she kept the card tucked inside her violin case, untouched but never forgotten. She told herself she didn't need help. She had been on her own for so long that she didn't know how to be anything else. But something about the way he had looked at her, the way he had listened, made her hesitate. One evening, as she played in a quieter part of the city, she noticed two men standing a short distance away, whispering to each other. Something about them made her uneasy. They weren't watching her the way most people did. They weren't listening to the music. They were watching her. She quickly packed up her violin and walked away, pretending not to notice. But as she turned, down an alley, she heard footsteps behind her. Elena! Her heart pounded. No one knew her name, not here. She spun around, gripping the handle of her violin case, like a weapon. One of the men stepped forward. He was older, his face worn with time, his eyes sharp. He wasn't a stranger. I've been looking for you, he said. Her stomach dropped. It was her father. She hadn't seen him in over 2 years. Not since the night she had run away. He looked different, thinner, his hair grayer. But the way he looked at her hadn't changed. That same intensity, that same control. You shouldn't be out here like this, he said, his voice calm but firm. Come home. Home. The word felt foreign. He wasn't asking. He was telling her. She shook her head. I don't have a home, she whispered. His expression darkened. Enough of this. You're coming with me. He reached for her arm, but she yanked away. She knew this version of him, the one who thought he could decide things for her, the one who had once taken her mother's violin and smashed it in a drunken rage, only for her to piece it back together with trembling hands. I'm not going anywhere with you, she said, her voice stronger this time. A long silence stretched between them. His jaw clenched. You don't have a choice. Elena's pulse raced. She did have a choice. She had spent too long running, too long hiding, too long believing she had nowhere to go. But now, she had a card in her pocket, a name, a door that had been opened, and she wasn't about to let it close. Without another word, she turned and ran. Daniel was sitting in his office. When the phone rang, he barely had time to say hello before a frantic voice came through. It's me, Elena said, breathless. I don't know where else to go. He didn't hesitate. Where are you? By the time she arrived, she was shaking. Daniel met her at the door, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push. He just led her inside. For the first time in years, Elena sat in a warm room with a roof over her head, her violin case still clutched tightly in her hands. You don't have to explain anything, Daniel said, sitting across from her. But if you want to, I'm here to listen. She looked at him, studying his face, and slowly, piece by piece, she told him about the nights spent on the streets, about the fear of being found, about the only thing she had left, her mother's violin. When she was done, Daniel sat in silence for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the shelf, pulling down an old worn-out violin. I had one too, he said softly. It was all I had. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat. You can stay here, Daniel said. We'll figure it out, but you have to promise me something. She nodded. Keep playing. For the first time in a long time, she smiled, and she did.